Queen Camilla left empty-handed by Queen Elizabeth II's cunning move. Why is Prince Edward's title more than just an honour? While King Charles III is critically ill, a lawyer's letter reveals an anti-invalidation clause that helped Edward thwart Camilla's ambitions. How did Queen Elizabeth set a trap in the law to protect Edward? The legal letter, bearing the seal of the Edinburgh solicitors, landed on King Charles III's desk at Buckingham Palace. The institution realised a terrifying truth. A royal title is not a ribbon. It is a loaded weapon. For 3 decades, the palace panned past Prince Edward, seeing only a quiet man in a loud family. They failed to realise that the late Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip had built a legal fortress around their youngest son, a fortress designed to protect the crown's private wealth from the very woman who now sits beside the king, Queen Camilla. The story begins on the 19th of November, 1947. King George V, sixth sensing the massive shifts in the British Empire, issued a letters patent, the highest form of sovereign command to create the Duct of Edinburgh for Philip Mountbatten. At the time it seemed straightforward. However, the fine print of that document, drafted with the precision of a constitutional surgeon, contained provisions that were never meant to expire. Most royal titles are honorific. They carry prestige but no bite. The Edinburgh Duke was different. Philip and Elizabeth, in a rare display of long-term strategic planning, ensured that this specific title carried reversionary interests and vesting protections. In plain English, they attach legal clauses to the title that do not dissolve when the holder dies. Instead, these provisions enter a state of abeyance, a legal hibernation waiting for a new holder to wake them up. When Prince Philip passed away in 2021, the palace assumed these powers died with him. They viewed the title as a vacant slot on an organisational chart. But law, unlike sentiment, does not grieve. The 1,947 letters patent remained active in the archives, holding secret commands that only a direct successor handpicked by the sovereign could trigger. In June 2022, during the height of the Platinum Jubilee, Queen Elizabeth II did something the public read as a mother's tender gift. She formally conferred the Dukedom of Edinburgh upon Prince Edward. The palace announcement used the word conferred rather than granted. In the world of high-stakes constitutional law, this distinction is a tectonic shift. To grant is to give something new. To confer is to transfer an existing legal instrument along with every encumbrance and power attached to it. By choosing Edward the Son, who had shown 30 years of unwavering scandal-free loyalty, the Queen was handing him the keys to the vault. Why the secrecy? Because the Queen was a student of history and a master of palace internal politics. She had watched the rise of Camilla. She had seen the influence the now Queen consort held over Charles. Elizabeth knew that once she was gone, the private estates of Sandringham and Balmoral assets worth hundreds of millions of pounds would be vulnerable to administrative restructuring that could alienate her other children or drain the family's private legacy. She turned Edward into a legal failsafe by attaching specific management rights and anti-invalidation clauses to the Edinburgh title. She ensured that Edward possessed a power similar to that of Princess Anne, the ability to activate royal bylaws that can effectively block or freeze a king's decision regarding private property if that decision is deemed detrimental to the hereditary line. Fast forward to late 2023, King Charles III, moving with the efficiency of a new monarch, began consolidating the royal portfolio. He made high V-value decisions regarding the income streams of the Duchy of Lancaster and the private Scottish estates. He moved fast, perhaps too fast, likely influenced by a desire to streamline the firm under the guidance of his closest advisor, Camilla. Then the letter arrived. It was not a brotherly note. It was a formal communication from external legal counsel representing the Duke of Edinburgh. It laid out in chillingly precise legal language that the King's recent decisions regarding estate management were in direct violation of the 1,947 provisions now held by Edward. The palace went quiet. Not the quiet of respect, but the quiet of a room that has just realised the floor is rigged with explosives. Charles, already battling a grueling schedule in the early stages of a serious cancer diagnosis, was suddenly faced with a legal challenge he could not dismiss. He could not simply order Edward to stop because Edward was not acting on a whim. He was acting on a mandatory secret order left by their mother. This is where the drama ignites the public imagination. The timing of the letter arriving as the king began his battle with cancer has split the court into 2 camps. They argue Edward is the ultimate protector. He waited 30 years in the shadows, enduring the weakness labels from the press, specifically so he could be the gay man who saved the monarchy from its own internal overreach. In this view, Edward is the hero. Elizabeth trained him to be the one son who values the institution over the individual. Critics point to the timing. Why now? Why force a legal confrontation while the king is physically vulnerable? They suggest Edward is leveraging the Queen's ghost power to secure his own financial future, fearing that under a Camilla-influenced reign, his branch of the family would be pushed to the fringes of the Windsor map. To understand why this title matters, one must look at who held it before. From the Duke of Gloucester to the naval hero Prince Philip, the Edinburgh Duke has always been reserved for the stalwarts, those whose primary duty is the stability of the throne's foundation. Edward's path to this title was not guaranteed. Reports in 2021 suggested Charles wanted to keep the title for himself or let it wither away. But the Queen's intervention in 2022 was a sovereign command that overrode Charles's preferences. She saw in Edward the steady hand, the man who ran a production company, married Sophie Rhys-Jones, and never once leaked a secret to the tabloids. He was the only one worthy of the 1947 mandate, because he was the only one who wouldn't use it for vanity. The Queen may be gone, but through this legal maneuver she remains the most powerful person in the room. This is the invisible hand of a monarch who ruled for 70 years. She knew that the law is the only thing that survives a change in the crown by using the letters patent of 1947. She ensured that her youngest son had the power to protect the Windsor bloodline even when she was no longer there to say no to Camilla's ambitions. As the King's lawyers scrambled to review documents they hadn't read in decades, one thing became clear. The Duke of Edinburgh is no longer the forgotten prince. He is the guardian of the fine print, and he has just activated a clause that could change the British monarchy forever. While the world watched the pageantry of the Platinum Jubilee in 2022, a cold legal calculation was being finalised behind the velvet curtains of Windsor Castle. Queen Elizabeth II, a monarch who had outlasted 14 US presidents and saw the rise and fall of empires, was not merely celebrating 70 years on the throne, she was fortifying the future. She knew that her eldest son, Charles, lived in a world of romantic idealism and administrative speed, often heavily influenced by the woman he had fought decades to bring into the royal fold, Camilla Parker B.S. The Camilla factor had long been a point of quiet concern for the late Queen and Prince Philip. It wasn't about personal animosity, it was about institutional preservation. As Camilla transitioned from Duchess of Cornwall to Queen Consort, her influence over the King's ear grew exponentially. The Queen feared that Camilla's vision for a slimmed-down monarchy was less about efficiency and more about consolidating the King's private wealth assets like Sandringham and the Balmoral estates away from the younger branches of the Windsor tree, specifically targeting the legacy intended for Edward and Anne. To block this, the Queen reached back into the archives for the 1947 letters patent. This was the masterstroke. By conferring the Duke of Edinburgh on Edward, she wasn't just giving him a title, she was activating a trustee power embedded by Prince Philip himself. Philip, a man of military precision, had insisted that the 1947 document include inalienable reversionary rights. This means that certain royal lands and income streams are not owned by the King to do with as he pleases. Instead, they are held in a legal state where the Duke of Edinburgh acts as a constitutional sentry. The Queen and Philip purposely detailed these provisions to ensure that no consort, no matter how influential, could persuade the King to sell, lease or redirect the private family wealth that had been set aside for the sovereign's children. Prince Edward, often dismissed as the quietest man in the family tree, was the only one deemed worthy of this secret order. Why? Because history had shown that the heir, Charles, and the spare, Andrew, were too compromised by their own dramas. Edward, however, had spent 30 years performing forgettable duties with a stoic loyalty that mirrored his mother's. The Queen saw in Edward the same quality Philip possessed, the ability to hold the line. By receiving the 1947 mandate, Edward became a living check on the King's power. Like Princess Anne, who manages the royal stables and vast agricultural interests with an iron fist, Edward was given the legal standing to counter-mandate decisions. If Camilla suggested a restructuring of the Balmoral income to favour her own interests or those of her non-royal children, Edward's lawyers could and did produce the 1947 documents to say, the law forbids this. The most explosive detail within the 1947 provisions is the anti-invalidation clause. In ordinary English law, King's word can often rewrite palace policy, but a letters patent is a sovereign act of law that stands above the personal whims of a sitting monarch. The Queen ensured that the specific rights granted to the Duke of Edinburgh regarding the private estates were non-dissolvable. When King Charles began his efficiency drive in 2023, he moved with the assumption that his authority was absolute. He did not realise that by granting Edward the title, he had effectively rearmed his younger brother with a veto power over the very assets he was trying to reorganise. This was the Queen's von Muten look her power from beyond the grave. She knew that Charles would feel obligated by sentiment to give Edward the title, and she used that very sentiment to trap the King in a legal cage of her own making. As the legal team representing Edward formally challenged the King's management of the Scottish estates, the palace split. The tension was palpable. The Camilla circle viewed Edward's move as a betrayal, a calculated opportunistic strike at a time when the King was physically weakened by cancer treatments. They argued that Edward was using ancient dusty scrolls to hold the modern monarchy hostage for financial gain. However, the loyalists saw it differently. To them, Edward was the ultimate realist. He wasn't attacking his brother, he was defending the crown's integrity. He was fulfilling the secret order handed to him by his parents. The drama wasn't just about money, it was a battle for the soul of the Windsor legacy. Was Edward a greyman taking advantage of a sick king, or was he the guardian of the fine prince, standing as the last line of defence against the Camillification of the royal estates? As the legal skirmish intensified within the soundproofed walls of Buckingham Palace, the true nature of the Edinburgh Mandate began to emerge from the shadows of the 1947 letters patent. This was never merely about a title to be printed on stationery. It was about the custodianship of the Windsor bloodline. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip understood a fundamental truth that Charles, in his pursuit of a modernized, slimmed-down monarchy, had seemingly overlooked. Private property is the only true independence a royal has. Without the ancestral lands of Sandringham and Balmoral, the monarch's children are merely tenants of the state. The Queen's secret order to Edward was designed to ensure that these lands remained a shield for the family, protected from the administrative curiosity of those who did not share the Windsor DNA, specifically the advisors and interests surrounding Queen Camilla. The 1947 documents contain a rare legal mechanism known as an irrevocable covenant of management. When Prince Philip helped draft these provisions decades ago, he insisted on a clause that allows the Duke of Edinburgh to act as a co-trustee over specific private income streams. This power does not belong to the individual as a person, but to the dictum itself, because the title was conferred upon Edward in 2022. He inherited a legal standing that allows him to freeze or veto any structural changes to the estates that might disadvantage the hereditary line. This is the power of the century. Just as Princess Anne holds a specialized authority over the royal stables and agricultural legacies, Edward was granted a financial veto. When King Charles, potentially influenced by Camilla's desire to consolidate assets to fund a new era of the monarchy, moved to streamline the Balmoral revenues in 2023, he hit a legal brick wall. Edward's lawyers produced the 1947 mandate, proving that the king literally lacked the authority to dissolve these specific provisions. The Queen had built a fail-safe into the law. The king can rule the country, but the Duke of Edinburgh guards the family's private gold. The selection of Edward for this role was a masterclass in character assessment by the late Queen. To hold such a veto power requires a man of absolute discretion and zero vanity. Historically, the Dukedom of Edinburgh has been held by men of steel: Prince Alfred, the naval prince, and Prince Philip, the modernizer. They were men who understood that their role was to support the centre, not to outshine it. Edward proved his worthiness through 30 years of invisibility. While Charles and Andrew were embroiled in public scandals that bled the monarchy's prestige, Edward stayed in the quiet zone. He accepted the weakness narrative from the tabloids without complaint, all while building a record of 30 years of faultless service. He was the only child the Queen could trust with a loaded legal weapon, because she knew he would only fire it in defence of the institution, never for personal glory. When the formal legal letter arrived at the palace, it triggered an immediate information blackout. King Charles, managing his cancer diagnosis and the heavy burden of the crown, found himself in a paradox. To fight Edward publicly would be to admit that the late Queen had shackled his power from the grave. To surrender privately would mean admitting that Camilla's influence over the estates had been legally checked. This created the central tension of the era. Is Edward the realist or the opportunist? Supporters see a man fulfilling a sacred vow to his dying mother to protect the family's core. Critics see a man using his brother's illness as a tactical window to assert financial dominance. But the 1947 letters patent remains indifferent to opinion. They say what they say in ink, and the Vongmark Queen lurk. The power of the absent Queen continues to dictate the terms of the Windsor's private survival. In the late months of 2023, as the winter mist settled over the turrets of Windsor Castle, a structural tremor shook the foundations of the British monarchy, not from a public scandal or a political uprising, but from the silent, ink-stained pages of a document drafted 75 years prior. When King Charles III received the formal legal dispatch from the council representing the Duke of Edinburgh, the atmosphere within the firm shifted from the mourning of a matriarch to the cold calculation of a courtroom. The king, already navigating the physical and emotional toll of a rigorous cancer diagnosis, found himself staring at a legal ghost. The 1947 letters patent issued by his grandfather, King George V, sixth, to Prince Philip, was not merely a historical record of a title being granted. It was discovered to be an active, binding, institutional override. Most royal scholars and palace insiders had long operated under a comfortable assumption that royal titles are honorific, carrying social prestige but no functional power over the monarch's will. However, the 1947 document, meticulously reviewed by Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip during the final decades of her reign, contained a hard-coded provision. This provision specifically stated that the holder of the Edinburgh dukedom acts as a perpetual guardian of the private estates of the bloodline. Unlike the Crown Estate, which is managed by the government, the private lands of Sandringham and Balmoral are the personal property of the Windsor. Under the 1947 mandate, the Duke of Edinburgh was granted a reversionary interest and a negative covenant. In legal terms, this means that while the king owns the land, he cannot make significant structural changes, sell-offs, or administrative redirections of the income without the explicit consent of the Duke of Edinburgh. The drama reached its peak in late 2023 and early 2024, centered on a single uncomfortable reality, the Camilla contingency. Sources close to the legal review suggest that the Queen and Philip grew increasingly concerned about the modernization plan, spearheaded by Charles, which many feared was being influenced by Queen Camilla's circle. The fear was not just about modernization, but about the potential alienation of the Windsor legacy. If the king were to consolidate the private wealth of the family into a singular streamlined king's purse, the other children, Edward and Anne, could effectively be evicted from their heritage or see their financial independence curtailed. Elizabeth II, the absent power, knew that she could not stop Charles from becoming king, nor could she prevent him from listening to his consort, but she could legalize a check on his power. By conferring the Edinburgh title on Edward in June 2022, at the Platinum Jubilee, she switched on the 1947 protection. She knew that Charles, bound by tradition and a sense of duty to his father's memory, would never refuse to give Edward the title. By doing so, Charles unknowingly signed away his absolute authority over the family's private gold. What the king's legal team discovered, to their horror, was that the 1947 provisions contained an anti-invalidation clause. This means that even a sovereign command from the king cannot strike down the Duke of Edinburgh's rights. The only way to dissolve these rights would be through an act of parliament, a move that would trigger a constitutional crisis and expose the family's private finances to public scrutiny. This is the secret power Edward now carries. Much like Princess Anne, who has long held an untouchable authority over the royal agricultural and equestrian interests, acting as the iron shield of the family's traditions, Edward has been transformed into the financial century. When he sent that legal letter in late 2023, he was not asking his brother for a favour. He was notifying the king that his recent attempts to reorganise the Balmoral income streams were legally void under the 1947 mandate. Why did the Queen choose Edward? To hold a veto over a king requires a man of extraordinary discretion and psychological fortitude. Historically, the Dukedom of Edinburgh has been held by figures who represented the solid core from Prince Alfred to Philip himself. Edward, through 30 years of invisible service, proved he was the only one who wouldn't use this power for a coup or for vanity. He is the man who showed up when the cameras weren't watching. He is the man who endured decades of being called the weak link while secretly being trained by his mother to be the final fail-safe. His worthiness lies in his patience. He waited until the very moment the institution was at risk of a Camilla influence deviation to pull the 1947 trigger. As the news of this legal friction began to leak through back channels, the public debate ignited. Edward is the ultimate loyalist. He is protecting the Queen's final wishes and ensuring that the Windsor family remains a family, not just a corporate brand managed by Charles and Camilla. He is the hero who holds the line when the king is too compromised to see the danger. The timing is brutal, sending a legal challenge while your brother is fighting cancer and the Princess of Wales is recovering from her own health struggles seems like a tactical ambush. Critics argue Edward is securing his slice of the pie before the rules of the game change forever. When the palace went quiet after receiving the letter, it was the silence of a trapped institution. Charles, a man of profound institutional respect, realized that his mother had outmaneuvered him from the grave. The Vong-Mart Queen lurk, the power of the Vong-Mart, absent. Queen was now speaking through Edward's lawyers. The 1947 letters patent were no longer a relic. They were the current law of the House of Windsor, and Prince Edward, the once forgotten son, had just become the most powerful sentry in the United Kingdom. He doesn't need to speak to the press, he just needs to hold the document. The battle for the royal estates had begun, and for the first time in his life, the quiet prince was the one holding all the cards. When the legal letter from Prince Edward's representatives arrived at Buckingham Palace in late 2023, the reaction was not one of familial irritation, but of institutional alarm. For the first time in the modern era, a sitting king found himself legally checked by a sibling using a document from the previous century. King Charles III, an institutionalist by nature, did not simply dismiss the claim. Instead, the palace took the unprecedented step of retaining external legal counsel specialists in constitutional property law and ancient peerage rights to conduct an urgent review of the 1947 letters patent. This was the silent blackout. The king realized that his internal legal team, focused on the day-to-day administration of the crown, had completely missed the legal tripwire his parents had laid decades ago. The core of the dispute centers on the management of Sandringham and Balmoral. Under the influence of the slimmed-down monarchy philosophy, often attributed to the strategic counsel of Queen Camilla, Charles had moved to centralize the income from these estates into a singular administrative pool. The goal was ostensibly efficiency, but the legal reality was a consolidation of power. Edward's lawyers argued that this consolidation violated the mandatory distribution clauses embedded in the 1947 mandate. These clauses were designed specifically to prevent any consort or advisor from diverting the family's private wealth away from the direct bloodline. By invoking these ancient rights, Edward effectively placed a legal lien on the king's reorganization plans. He wasn't just asking for money, he was asserting a right of consent. Every decision Charles made regarding the private estates now required the Duke of Edinburgh's signature. This was the anti-invalidation power in full effect, a check on the king that even the king's own diagnosis could not pause. The timing of this legal strike occurring as Charles managed a grueling cancer treatment created a fierce internal debate. Supporters of Edward argue that he had no choice. Law does not wait for a convenient time. If Charles had been allowed to finalize the consolidation of the estates, the 1,947 protections might have been waived by precedent. Edward was acting as the sovereign sentry, fulfilling a secret order from no-young Elizabeth to ensure the family's survival regardless of the king's personal health. Critics within the Camilla circle view this as a cold-blooded tactical move. They see a younger brother using the king's vulnerability to carve out his own financial empire, while the king's attention is divided. They point to the 30 years of Edward's loyalty as a long-game strategy to gain the Queen's ultimate trust and the key to the vault. To understand Edward's new role, one must look at Princess Anne. She has long operated as an untouchable within the family, managing the agricultural and equestrian legacies with absolute autonomy. She is the Iron Shield. The Queen's masterstroke was giving Edward a similar functional domain. While Anne guards the tradition and the land, Edward now guards the legal and financial fine print. The 1,947 letters patent turned a quiet man into a constitutional sentinel. By the time the King's external counsel finished their review, the verdict was clear. The 1,947 provisions were active and enforceable. The King could not override his brother's veto without a public legal battle that would tear the institution apart. The Vongmart Queen, lurk the power of the absent Queen, had won. The documents had spoken and the King was forced to go very, very quiet. As the legal dust settled in the early months of 2024, the halls of Buckingham Palace remained quiet, but it was a silence born of resolution rather than confusion. The external counsel's verdict was absolute. The 1,947 letters patent were not merely historical artifacts, they were active constitutional anchors. King Charles III, facing the dual burden of his crown, and his health, was forced to accept a reality he had not envisioned at his coronation. The administrative streamlining of the private estates, widely seen as a project influenced by Queen Camilla's vision for a consolidated monarchy, had hit an immovable object. That object was the Edinburgh veto, a legal power revived by a mother's foresight and an absent father's signature. Prince Edward did not celebrate. True to the character he has maintained for over 30 years, there were no victory laps in the press, no leaked briefings to claim dominance over his brother. He simply returned to his duties, but with a new invisible weight of authority. By activating the anti-invalidation clauses and the mandatory distribution provisions of the 1947 mandate, Edward ensured that the private wealth of Sandringham and Balmoral remained a protected sanctuary for the Windsor bloodline, legally insulated from any future restructuring. This was the fulfillment of his role as the sovereign sentry. Like Princess Anne, who guards the physical and traditional borders of the family's legacy, Edward has emerged as the guardian of the legal fine print. He proved that his 30 years of invisibility were not a sign of passivity, but a period of deep observation and preparation. He was the only one worthy of the 1947 secret, because he was the only one who would use it as a shield, never as a sword. The debate over Edward's timing challenging a king during a cancer battle will likely persist in the annals of royal history. Edward saved the family from a corporate consolidation that would have eventually marginalized the younger royals and concentrated all power and wealth in a single vulnerable point. He acted with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that if the legal window closed, the Queen's protections would be lost forever. Critics will always see the tactical ambush. They will argue that he leveraged a moment of extreme weakness to secure a financial principality that Charles would have never granted under normal circumstances. However, the evidence leans toward the architect's plan. Queen Elizabeth II did not leave an explanatory letter, she left a legal instrument. She knew that by the time the 1947 provisions were needed, she would be gone. And the only thing that would hold up against the Camilla factor or the King's own impulses was the cold hard law of the letters patent. In the end, this story is about the Vongmart Queen Lurk, the power of the Vongmart absent monarch. Elizabeth II ruled for 70 years by understanding that people change but documents remain. She saw the rise of Camilla, the illness of her son, and the potential fractures in her house. By conferring the Edinburgh title on Edward in 2022, she reached out from the future to protect her family's past. The King's quietness, after receiving the legal letter, was the ultimate acknowledgement of his mother's superior strategy. He realized that he was not just fighting a brother. He was facing the combined will of Philip and Elizabeth. The Minkin Chaman Suckling Vunquin remains the silent law of the land. The Quiet Prince is now the sentinel of the Windsor Vault, and the legacy of the British royal family is for now legally safe behind the fine print of a 75-year-old document.